Thank you, Morgan, for those songs. Rob, for the comments on the table tonight. I invite you to open your Bibles, open to the book of 2 Samuel. That's where we're going to be at tonight. 2 Samuel chapter 12. That's where we're going to be beginning tonight. We are quickly approaching the end of this series we began last year and looking at the life of David. And by no means has this been an exhaustive study. I think it has been a representative study of looking at the life of this great Old Testament patriarch, this great Old Testament figure. We have seen the highs and we have begun to see the lows in his life, unfortunately. And tonight we're going to be taking a statement that we're going to read from the 12th chapter of 2 Samuel of the immediate aftermath of his sin, or sins, that he committed with his act of adultery with Bathsheba. I recall your attention again back to that, just the highlights there, that the text of that narrative in chapter 11, if memory serves me correctly, just turn a page back, tells us everything we really need to know about that incident, that sin in his life. Samuel, or the compiler of 2 Samuel, records here, "Now it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at Jerusalem." When we were preaching through 1 Samuel, we noted how Israel wanted a king like the other nations to go and fight their battles for them, to judge over them, to rule over them. And what they got was a king like the other nations. They got a king after man's own heart in Saul, who did not really fight their battles for them and really did not administer judgments for them. He, on the whole, every time you looked for a leader to do the thing, you found Saul cowering in his tent. And you found David, the shepherd boy, doing what Saul should have done. And unfortunately, in chapter 11, what we found out is that David acts a lot like Saul in chapter 11. He didn't just ignore all the red lights when it came to this situation. He blew past them at 50 over the speed limit. He just did not care. But unlike Saul, when David's confronted with his sin, he wholeheartedly accepts it and repents of it. And part of that also is David understands that no sin is an isolated affair, that there are ripple effects to sin. And the sad thing is, one of those ripple effects that David will have to deal with the rest of his life. If you look now in verse 10 of 2 Samuel chapter 12, we're going to be looking at this section in more detail in just a minute, but Nathan the prophet says to David, "So now the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me," referring to God, "and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife." And you look down at verse 14. "However, by this deed you have given occasion to the enemies of Yahweh to blaspheme. The son also that is born to you shall surely die." David's going to learn very quickly that you can't ever, no matter how hard you try, have your cake and eat it too. That there are severe consequences and reactions and ripple effects to everything we do in life, good or bad. Hopefully we're working on the good, and those ripple effects are good ripple effects, but even in sin, the ripple effects are there. David absolutely seeks forgiveness when confronted with his sin. You look back at verse 12 and 13. After Nathan tells him the parable of this man who had one little ewe lamb. He was like a member of the family, and a rich man who has a ton of flocks. And his rich man has a guest come in town, and the rich man takes the ewe lamb and slays it and serves it to his guest. David's incensed. He's enraged. It's such an act of injustice. And you could see what one commentator said in this passage was, it is the most dramatic moment in all of the Old Testament. That was his opinion. It's up there for me. But David's like, who is this man? He needs to pay fourfold for what is done. And Nathan looks at him and says, you're him. You could probably hear a pin drop in that room when Nathan said that. Unlike Saul, who would have ducked, dive, and dodge around responsibility and try to spin it to be somebody else's fault, here's what Saul would have done in that situation. It's Bathsheba's fault. It's Uriah's fault. No, David recognizes he's in the wrong, and he asks simply in 12 and 13. Verse 13, he says, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against God. And Nathan said to David, Yahweh has also taken away your sin. You shall not die. David is absolutely forgiven. God said he was. But David cannot undo his actions. He can't bring Uriah back from the dead. He can't undo sleeping with Bathsheba and the child that is now in her womb. He can't undo any of that. He has to live with that reality now. And he has to live with the reality of what God's going to do as a consequence of the fact that David's actions as king, as leader of the nation, as a representative of God to his people. David has set a horrible example for the nation. And he has given, as God says, a reason for the enemies of God to speak ill of God. Well, if this is your king, why should I serve him? If this is how a righteous king acts, I don't want anything to do with this Yahweh guy. Your king takes what he wants, kills the people he doesn't like. He's a despot. I mean, look at what the prophet says in verse 9. Why have you despised the word of God by doing evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword. And you have taken his wife to be your wife, and you have killed him with the sword of the sons of Ammon. David probably thought he was pretty smart in chapter 11. Well, I won't kill him. I'll send a note to Joab, and I'll tell Joab to send Uriah out to the fiercest of fight, and when he's out there, we'll have the troops pull away. David may not have used a sword as his murder weapon, but David still used the weapon to kill Uriah, and that was Joab and the Ammonites. He can't undo any of that. And there's parallels we'll see at the end of the lesson in the New Testament. I think of the Apostle Paul. He was 100% forgiven. He knew the great goodness and graciousness of God and how great that forgiveness was. But for the rest of Paul's days, he had to live with the knowledge that he was in hearty agreement putting Christians to death. That he had persecuted the church of God. That he had blasphemed the name of God at one point in his life. Now, this is a Brenden 2-cent idea, so take it or leave it. Scholars and Bible students for centuries have tried to figure out what the thorn in Paul's flesh was. I have half a mind. It's just the knowledge of the fact, no matter what church he would go into in the Middle East, he could be responsible for the death of some of their loved ones. That kind of knowledge that's on him. Now, he didn't dwell on it. He didn't ruminate on it. He pressed on, as we talked about this morning. But Paul, I'll get the name eventually. David couldn't undo any of his actions, just like Paul couldn't have done any of his actions. He had to deal with the reality that this is the reality that I live in now. As we mentioned before, that sin is never a solitary affair. When we teach rightly, the Bible does not teach original sin. Ezekiel 18 makes it abundantly clear. The son shall not bear the punishment for the father's iniquity. That is a biblical statement that does not mesh with original sin. I think sometimes, though, we make the mistake, because I made the mistake of thinking, well, sin only affects me. No, that's not true. Sin affects everybody. Sin affects everybody. You know, you take the sin of Achan in Numbers 7. People have always wondered, well, why did Achan's family get punished? Well, first of all, God was the judge, jury, and executioner in that incident, so we know that was 100% just. But secondly, Achan, you're telling me Achan went back to his tent with his arms full of contraband and no one noticed that? You're telling me that no one in his family noticed him digging a big hole underneath his bed to hide the contraband that was cursed? See, our ancient brethren understood that sin doesn't happen in isolation and sin doesn't just only affect you. Achan's family tolerated or allowed the situation to exist that allowed Achan to do that. Just like in 1 Corinthians 5, the church at Corinth collectively gets chastised for their sin, the fact that they had not disciplined the man who had his father's wife. They weren't guilty of that sin, but they were guilty of a different sin. They were allowing a culture and an environment to exist in which that sin was allowed to grow and fester and happen. Likewise, David's sin didn't just affect him. There's a man dead as a result of his sins. There's a woman who's dealing with, I can only imagine the level of trauma she's dealing with. The fact that she's now married to the guy who just murdered her late husband. I mean, it's a different world, it's a different place. We have to make allowances for that. But you think about the consequence of David is doing. And we're going to look at David's sons. His sons, I believe, are clearly impacted by this incident. We're not covering the sins of Ammon and his half-sister. But the paraphrased Brenden translation would have underneath that whole chapter of that's messed up. It's just wrong. His sons are clearly not affected. And so David's one sin, and maybe thinking, well, I just really want to sleep with Bathsheba. No, it had massive trickle-down effects the rest of his life. And maybe a practical application point for us to consider. Sin, as tantalizing, as appealing as it looks in the moment, it will hurt more people than just you. It will affect more people than just you. It always will. And sometimes people are like, well, why do you make such a big deal about church discipline? Why do you make such a big deal about holiness? Because sin is that serious. And a congregation that doesn't care enough about its members to take sin seriously doesn't love its members and doesn't love each other. Sin is too deadly and too serious for us to take it lightly. And David learned the hard way. He took it too lightly. Again, you look what Nathan the prophet says. He despised God in verse 9. He struck down Uriah the Hittite. He's involved the sons of Ammon now in sin. A child's going to die as a consequence of actions. And the whole nation's affected. You know, there was a time in this country that the moral failings of a leader, was a national scandal and disgrace. I was just a knee-high during the whole Clinton thing. But the fact that there was a whole impeachment inquiry over of extramarital affair, that probably would not happen today, if you ask me honestly. But you wind back nearly 30 years ago, people were incensed. Like that's a horrible, immoral thing. The country was affected by that. You have to think that the country is just equally as affected by this. As we read at the beginning of this section here, while David is forgiven, God will visit upon him consequences. Because as leader of God's people and leader of this nation, he has disgraced the name of God by his actions, and he's given occasion in verse 14 for the enemies of God to speak ill of God. And so we see some of those consequences. Verse 11. Thus Yahweh, says Yahweh, behold, I will raise up evil against you from your own household. I will even take your wives from before your sight and give them to your companion, and he will lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. Indeed, you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. What David did in private, what David did secretly, what David tried to conceal, God's saying, I'm going to allow the same things to happen to you, but it will be a public scandal. And unfortunately, we see that at least 3 of David's sons will die by the sword. You have Ammon, Absalom, and Abijah. Look in 2 Samuel chapter 13, just over a page or two in your Bibles, verses 28 through 29. Now, I'm skipping over the awful, awful sin that Ammon committed against his stepsister. But Absalom is enraged and incensed by his actions, and you see here in 28, 29, then Absalom commanded his young men, saying, see now, when Ammon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Ammon, then put him to death. Do not fear, for have I not myself commanded you? Be strong and be valiant. Thus the young men of Absalom did to Ammon just as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. So yes, you already have some heinous sin and crimes being committed within the royal family, but now you have the sons of the king basically killing each other because they felt like it, or there's a situation here that they felt called for this kind of thing. You see in chapter 18, in verse 15, Absalom, which is another tragic tale. Absalom, we're going to come to this in just a minute, but Absalom rebels against his father, thinks he can usurp his own father as being king, and he dies tragically in a battle. In verse 15 here, you see, and 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absalom and put him to death. Verses 19 through 32 is David's lament over Absalom's death. And I want to say at this point here that even we as the species are complicated. I mean that we got layers. And I can't imagine this because I'm not a parent yet. But despite the sins and the rebellions of David's sons, he still shows himself to be a man of God because he wants to lead these sons in the right way. And he is absolutely just struck with grief when Absalom dies. He's upset that these things are happening with his own household. He's seeing his family basically disintegrate around him. And he knows. It's all started with his actions. And so why, yes, they're free moral agents, they're making their own decisions. I can imagine David is feeling partly to blame for the chaos that's going on. Because he may not have made them sons do this, but look at David's own life, and we've seen the moral failures, and, well, as the old proverb goes, more is caught than taught. And then in David's old age, in 1 Kings 2 and verse 25, while David has not yet gone on to meet his maker yet on here, but we see here in verse 25, his son Adonijah is put to death. So King Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jedidiah, and he fell upon him, that is, Adonijah, and so he died. You know, there's another proverb that parents shouldn't have to bury their children. And here David ends up having to bury 3 of his own sons. That's not all. His son Absalom rebels against his father and openly lays with his father's concubines for all of Israel to see, thus fulfilling what God had said was going to happen, of how God was going to return to David his own sins upon his head, to use the biblical phrase there. You look back in 2 Samuel verse 16. 2 Samuel chapter 16, looking at verses 15 through 16. Now Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, had entered Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. And it happened that when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, that Hushai said to Absalom, "Long live the king, long live the king." Now, we're skipping over his actual politicking and getting all Israel to get him to declare him king, but he's now at this point planning to crown himself king and usurp the throne from his own father. And the tragic thing here is that Hushai the Archite is David's friend and now Absalom's friend. He's giving counsel to both of them because later on you see here in verse 19, besides, this is the Archite here, Hushai, besides whom shall I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son, referring to David? As I have served in your father's house, so your father's presence, so I will serve in your presence. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, that as well, give your advice, what shall we do? And Ahithophel said to Absalom, go to your father's concubines, into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, then all Israel will hear that you have made yourselves odious to your father. The hands of all who are with you shall you also be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if one asked of the word of God. And so all the counsel of Ahithophel was regarded by both David and Absalom. So you have, I misspoke earlier, you have Hushai and Ahithophel, both are playing both sides here. And they're giving advice here to Absalom on how to disgrace his own father. Now, this would be covered in kind of the uncovering your father's nakedness and disgracing him and making him basically trying to assert yourself as I'm the new king in town. And this is the sad thing in Israel, that in other nations throughout history, this was standard practice. If you wanted to take the throne, kill your father, kill your brothers, make sure no one is left there, and you're all good to go. But Israel was supposed to be different. Even with the king, Israel was not supposed to have these kind of petty infightings and quarrels and intrigue and assassinations and brother killing brother and all. Israel was not supposed to have that. Even with the king, they were supposed to be ruled by God. The king was supposed to set the example. But we see here that David's family is just a mess at this point. Now, not directly related to David's consequences, but still along the list of how else could things go wrong, there's another civil war that breaks out even after Absalom tries to usurp his father. You look in 2 Samuel chapter 20. And this is where we see the damage has been already dealt to the nation as a consequence of David's actions. Chapter 20 of 2 Samuel, verses 1 and 2. Now a vile fellow happened to be there whose name was Sheba, the son of Berchi, a Benjamite, and he blew the trumpet and said, we have no portion in David, nor do we have inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tent, so Israel. So all the men of Israel went up, following David and following Sheba, the son of Berchi. But the men of Judah clung to their king from the Jordan even to Jerusalem. What's going on here? Well, you have the revolt of Sheba. And basically we're told everyone follows Sheba except for Judah. Well, why is that the case? David was universally beloved when he took the throne, and yet we've seen the last couple of years that have been covered in 2 Samuel that we're very just touching the tip of the iceberg on, David's credibility as a righteous, just king has just gone out the window. Now, the Civil War ends with them finally cornering Sheba, and he gets beheaded, and the uprising is put down. But unfortunately, as we close the pages of 2 Samuel, David rectifies a situation with the Gibeonites in chapter 21, with the misdeeds of Saul still coming back, and he has to settle that. He writes some of his last Psalms in 22, thanking God for his deliverance. But David's last acts, which we will cover next month, Lord willing, will be trying to set his remaining son, Solomon, up for as much success as he can possibly give him when he takes the throne. In a sense, you have a father who sees the failures in his other children, and he wants to do everything he can to do right by this one. And I think to some degree he had some success in that. To some degree. But, what do we take away from this? We're 21st century Christians. What's the lesson for us from this abysmal period in David's life? That hasn't already become clear by now, but we need to understand that we can be forgiven, but that does not mean there will not be ripple effects in our lives, for good or for evil, either one. You do good, you follow God, you pursue righteousness, that's going to have very positive ripple effects in your life. You follow wickedness, you commit sin and iniquity, you make that your course, well, that's going to have ripple effects as well. It's a universal principle that the Apostle Paul talked about in Galatians chapter 6. Look at verses 7 and 8. In Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8, he says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life." Now, think back on all the lessons we've done on David. He had a very strong start. He was sowing spiritually early on. And he reaped spiritually because of that. But we saw that when he became king, we had little incidences that started popping up. David's weakness was women. We almost had a David and Bathsheba incident with Abigail and Nabal. He was ready to kill Nabal for an offense. Had Abigail not been there, he probably would have. Abigail was there to calm him down and make peace there. But you have these statements throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel, or 2nd Samuel when David became king, and David continued to multiply wives. Just in passing. But that was what the narrative was telling us. Something is brewing here that's not good. Because we go back to 1 Samuel 8. The warnings about what the king was going to do. He was going to multiply. He was going to take and take and take. And you see that part of the rebuke that Nathan has for David in 1 Samuel 11 and 12 is, was it a little thing that God, gave you not only all of Saul's household, but the kingdom, and I blessed you all these ways? Basically what God's saying is was that not enough for you? David had become ungrateful for the privilege and blessing that God had given to him. He had started sowing corruption. And so it's very telling when the narrative tells us, beginning of 1 Samuel 11, that in the season when kings go out to war and do what kings are supposed to do, David's not acting and doing what kings are supposed to do. He's staying in Jerusalem, laying on his couch all day. He's taking it easy. He's not out there pursuing and sowing spiritually like he ought to have been. And the final takeaway from this is past sins do not define you. Despite David's moral failings, despite the consequences and the ripple effects in his own life, David is still referred to as a man after God's own heart. He is still upheld as a great example of faith in the New Testament. But why is that? How do we reconcile those two things? Well, you contrast with Saul. Saul, from the beginning to his dying day, never once took ownership for any of his wrongdoings. Never. Anytime he did what he wanted and he got called on the carpet for it, it was the people's fault. Well, aren't you the king? Anytime he did something where he offered a sacrifice when he should not have, and Nathan shows up and says, you were not allowed to do that. So, well, I forced myself to do it. Have you ever thought, how do you force yourself to do something? Did he hold himself at knife point while he did the sacrifice? Saul didn't take ownership. David, by contrast, was not a sinless man. The Bible never says that. But he was a man who, I think you see his heart when Nathan confronts him. It was clear as day. You're in the wrong on this. David does not deflect. David does not spin. David does not do anything Saul did. David says, I have sinned against God, and I pray he would forgive me. That's the big difference. And when you look at the whole of David's life, he is Godward directed all the time. Even in his failures, he hides away from God for a little bit, but he can't escape the fact that he's not right with his God. That nags at him. It eats away at him. Read Psalm 32 or 31, where David says, when I'm silent about my sin, my body wasted away. He felt the guilt within him, and it moved him, as Corinthians says, to godly repentance. Saul could have sinned a bagillion times in one day, eaten dinner, wiped his face, and gone to bed, and probably would have slept like a baby. I think there's a New Testament parallel to this. We mentioned him before, the Apostle Paul. Not that he is guilty of the same things, but you look at Paul's manner of life before he became a Christian. He was a zealous Jew, and he'll even himself and say, not according to knowledge. But you look in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 13 and 14. These are not my words. These are the Apostle Paul's words, how he describes himself. 1 Timothy chapter 1, starting in verse 13. Even though I was formerly a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent aggressor, yet I was shown mercy because I acted ignorantly in unbelief. And the grace of our Lord was more than abundant with the faith and love which are in Christ Jesus. Paul doesn't have to list every wrong he ever committed. He knew what they were. We have record of many of them in the book of Acts early on when he is still known as Saul the persecutor. But when he obeyed the gospel and he was forgiven, he knew he was forgiven. Did he have to face perhaps the ripple effects of some of the deeds he'd done in his past life? Absolutely, as we all do. But he didn't let that past life define who he was. And you know what's funny? Some 2,000 years later, we're preaching and teaching from the books and the letters he wrote, and I can't remember the last time I really had to talk about Paul's former manner of life except in tonight's sermon. Because when we think of Saul of Tarsus or Paul the Apostle, the first thing to come to mind is not, oh, he was a violent persecutor of God's... No, we don't think that. We think of, he is the great evangelistic apostle. And even with David. When we think about David, the first thing that comes to mind, or maybe it's close, but it's not necessarily, at least to talk to me, it's not these later years. That we think of the shepherd boy who courageously faced Goliath because of his confidence and faith in God. We think of David. We think of the songbird of Israel who wrote all the Psalms. We think of David who wanted to build God's temple. That's what we normally think about. It's not that those other misdeeds are erased, But when you look at the whole of his life, that's what shines through. Why? He didn't let the past define him, and he didn't let the past prevent him from taking the next step. And so as we slowly bring this lesson to a close, and the series to a close, and bring this to a close tonight, the practical takeaway from this: we all have a past. That's clear. The thing that kind of blows my mind is that I sometimes forget that my mom and dad had like a 30-year history before I ever came up on the scene. And I still don't know half of it. Like, I get maybe 1 or 2 facts about my dad's life a year, maybe. At this point, I know he had a truck and he went to high school. That's it. But my point is, we all have a past. But the funny thing is, when we interact with each other, do you really care about that? No. And guess what? God doesn't care about that. If you are in Christ, that is forgiven, and you are being strengthened to press on to newer and higher planes of being. Higher, like the old hymn came to my mind there, but you're pressing on to a better quality of life. You're pressing on to be a better person. You're pressing on to be the person God knows you can be. And I think maybe that's one of the many reasons why we have the life of David recorded for us. There's no one beyond God's grace. There's nothing anyone has done that cannot be forgiven and God cannot use for his purposes to declare his glory. Those verses we read in 1 Timothy 1, 13 through 14, Paul cites that as an example for those who would believe. If God can save me, Paul's saying, he can save anybody. And maybe you're here tonight and that really resonates with you. You're ready to make that commitment to Christ. You know, Jesus himself said in Mark's Gospel, in chapter 16, verse 16, that the one who believes in him and is baptized shall be saved. The one who does not believe in him stands condemned. But maybe you've done that in the past and you're struggling. You need encouragement or you need prayers of forgiveness. You're accepted the Lord's invitation. We invite you to come down here at the front. Just meet me there as they were standing and sing the song that's been selected.